Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's March 13, 2017, and today we are speaking with Dr. Mark Vickel, Postdoctoral Research Associate in the School of Geosciences at the University of Sydney. Mark's research focuses on the intersections between rural livelihoods and agrarian change in South and Southeast Asia. He is currently one of several researchers involved in the Australia Research Council's Feeding Myanmar project, which seeks to explain food and nutrition insecurity under conditions of rapid change. Hello, Mark.
Hello, Luke. Thanks for having me.
The Feeding Myanmar project, in technical terms, is a nutrition-sensitive analysis of livelihood decision-making in rural Myanmar. I'm sure each of those words has been carefully selected, so could you give us an overview of the project, but also speak a bit about what livelihoods are, why analysing decision-making is important, and how this project differs from analyses that are not nutrition-sensitive?
Okay, well, primarily the project's focused on food security, understanding food security in the Myanmar context. And I guess food security as a concept has been traditionally understood in terms of production. That's where the concept of food security started back in the 1970s, where people were concerned about national and global food balances, and it was very much seen as a supply problem. Since then, however, our thinking has changed, and the concept has really evolved down to the household scale. And this is predominantly to do with the work of Amartya Sen, an Indian economist who analysed the Bengal famine and a number of other famines in the mid-20th century and came to the conclusion that there was enough food around during these times of famine, and the problem of food security was less about production and more about the capacities and capabilities of households to access food. So the concept of food security then has evolved into more of a livelihoods approach, where we're more interested in understanding what households do to construct a living, to earn income, to pursue different types of livelihood activities in rural spaces, and how their different decisions around how they construct their livelihoods, how does that result in different food security outcomes for households pursuing different pathways. And so the second development in food security thinking over the last 20 years has been the focus on nutrition. So food security, well, the FAO defines food security as existing when all people at all times have physical, social and economic access to sufficient, safe and nutritious food, which meets their dietary needs and food preferences. So again, from that productivist focus on a calorie approach to food security, just ensuring that people had enough quantity of food, we've now more evolved into understanding food security as more than just calories, more than just having enough rice to eat, but being able to access a diversity of foods to satisfy all those micronutrient requirements that people need to live a healthy life. So in recent years then, this concept of nutrition-sensitive agriculture has emerged as a concept that we need to be concerned about. So that's why we really emphasise nutrition in our project here in Myanmar. And that has also influenced the multidisciplinary nature of our project. So I'm a human geographer. There's a couple of us involved in the project. We come from more of the rural development livelihoods angle. We also work with a development economist from University of Western Australia and also some public health epidemiologists from the School of Public Health at the University of Sydney. So the livelihoods approach to understanding food security comes from Amartya Sen's work, and we can use the livelihoods approach to, I guess, understand that households can secure their food supply through three primary pathways, right? So as a rural household, you can either grow your own food to eat for self-consumption, you can earn income and buy food through markets, or you can be the recipient of food transfers through social welfare systems, okay? So through those three pathways then, we need to understand food security as a livelihoods problem. and at the household scale, understand how food insecurity then is a result of how different households and individuals within those households with different access to critical livelihood assets can construct their livelihoods to result in optimal food security outcomes, but also optimal livelihood and poverty alleviating outcomes.
So I understand you're performing extensive fieldwork in Myanmar as part of this project. Could you explain where you're going, the data you're looking for, how you're creating it, and the time frame for the project?
Sure. So as part of a livelihoods approach to food security, I guess there's a growing realisation that rural livelihoods are starting to shift away from agriculture. So in the past, when we thought about rural households, we would predominantly think about them through an agricultural lens, assuming that most rural households were farmers. This is more and more problematic. In a lot of developing countries, farm sizes are shrinking. There's problems of landlessness, while at the same time, there's growth in the non-farm economy, and more rural households are now turning their focus to accessing these kinds of opportunities. So livelihood diversification is a term that we use, is increasingly important for the success of households, right? So that also means then that today fewer rural households are securing their food supply solely through self-production or subsistence agriculture, as we kind of thought about it in the past. So securing food through markets is more and more important, and therefore the ability to earn income through either agriculture or non-farm activities is more important. One aspect to this research is in India, nutritional indicators have not kept up with economic growth. So in countries like China and Vietnam, their history of development is one of increasing economic growth and improving nutritional outcomes tied to that. But in India, this hasn't been the case. So this has been termed the agricultural nutrition disconnect, where rural households are struggling to enter the non-farm economy, but at the same time can no longer meet their nutritional needs through agriculture. And there's important gender aspects to that as well. Also in India, there's an increasing trend of the feminisation of agriculture, whereas more men leave villages, migrate away to try and find work in the city, women are left with the burden of agricultural work and farm production. And so this has impacted on food security in India in a few ways as well. So the key entry point for our research here in Myanmar then is, first of all, very little is known about the food security and livelihood conditions of rural households in Myanmar, given the isolation of the country over the last 50 years. So our first aim is to collect a whole lot of reliable and robust data on what exactly the situation is out there. So we're working in 3 areas, 2 townships in the Delta, Malbin and Chiklet, 2 townships in the dry zone, which are Pakoku and Yeseju, and 2 townships in Chin State, Mindat and Kampalet. We've selected 20 villages in each township, and then at the beginning of last year we conducted a large-scale household survey asking households about their income sources, their livelihood assets. They're collecting demographic data, collecting data about food security experiences, and also taking anthropometric measurements of children and women, so height and weight measurements. So this provides data on stunting and wasting and these anthropometric indicators of food insecurity.
So it sounds like you're taking a lot of indicators there. Are they all going to be primarily used for this project, or is part of this project harvesting quite a lot of data that you can use in the future?
Yeah, well, the first aim was to collect a large data set. So we're surveying 3,400 households, which in the context of food security and livelihood research in Myanmar is one of the larger data sets. So we hope that that data is particularly useful for policy making, particularly in the context of the new government in Myanmar, the formation of new agricultural and rural development policies. So we hope that, our survey work can provide some reliable and robust indicators that can be used in a policy sense, also by the NGO community. But yeah, we're certainly started this project with the aim of establishing a long-term research project in Myanmar to really understand change over time. And that's particularly something that I'm interested in as a rural livelihoods researcher, is establishing some good panel data sets and understanding how things are changing over time, particularly in the context of this important moment in Myanmar's history when the economy is opening up, things are rapidly changing. It's a bit of a cliche to talk about Myanmar in these terms, but it's true. And we see that in our field sites, that even in remote places like Chin State, that there are rapid changes entering the rural economy, and this is really going to fundamentally affect how rural households pursue their livelihoods and which households succeed and which get left behind.
Well, that's perfect that you brought up Chin State just again, because I was going to say maybe we should go down to earth, and you've spent a lot of time in Chin State recently. So thinking about what we've just been talking about, what's the situation like in, I think, southern Chin State, where you've spent most of your time?
Yeah, so the second part of our work, which is predominantly the focus of what I do, is following up this large-scale data collection exercise that we've done with some more in-depth qualitative household interviews to really get down to the nuts and bolts of livelihood decision-making, of issues of power and politics in these rural villages, and issues of wealth distribution and how that relates to food security outcomes. I've just literally yesterday returned from Chin State, where we were working in 2 villages up there. We selected those villages as in-depth case studies to follow up on. And Chin State is, I guess, kind of where my heart lies as well in this project. I've spent most of my time in Chin State and have really come to become entirely fascinated with what's going on up there. So Chin State is known to be the poorest and most food insecure region in Myanmar. So for those who don't know where Chin State is, it's in the southwest of Myanmar, up against the Indian border, and the Chin people occupy the Arakan Hills, which are a mountain range between Myanmar and India, extending up from Rakhine State. So the Chin people share a common heritage with many tribes from Nagaland and Mizoram across the Indian border, and a lot of Chin people still live as they have for the last hundreds of years in very remote villages, surviving off predominantly shifting cultivation. So this is perhaps very marginal livelihoods, not much infrastructure, very hard to get to these villages. And along with that is a whole litany of interesting social institutions that mediate the livelihoods of Chin people. So the first is land. So in the lowlands of Myanmar, agricultural land is, well, it used to be predominantly government-owned, but now it's privately owned by individuals who have land title to the land they farm. If you're a shifting agriculturalist, you are shifting around the landscape, and often the land that you farm on you don't own, and you certainly don't have title to. There's no certificate that you hold from the government that says I own or I have rights to farm this piece of land. So there's a whole range of land issues, and land tenure regimes in southern Chin are a bit of a mix between some private ownership of land that's ancestral and people claim tribal rights to particular patches of land. This is usually established by whoever cleared the land first, whoever pioneered that patch of land can claim long-term ownership and rights to that land. Again, nothing's written down. These are all kind of verbal histories of land ownership, or you might mark your land out with a couple of banana trees or something like that. There's also land that's collectively owned. So in southern Chin, it's mostly tribally collectively owned. So a tribe will own several plots of land, and people of that tribe have rights to access and grow food on that land, and access to that land is governed by these collective institutions. The other thing about agriculture in Chin is it's in the mountains, and these people are farming on extremely steep slopes, so it's quite marginal agriculture. The soil's quite poor, not a lot of nutrients. Also, a real problem of water access. So Chin is known as having the longest monsoon season in Myanmar, but it's also extremely dry in the summer, so it kind of ranges from one extreme to the other. It's either these flooding rains in the monsoon season, which cause all sorts of problems in terms of landslides. You can't access villages. A lot of villages are completely shut off during the monsoon season. And then into summer and the dry season, where people struggle to access water for even their household needs. So there's not a lot of productive agriculture. What's grown are predominantly traditional crops, millet, corn, and a small variety of vegetable crops. So the two main crops that Chin people grow are Satni and Satwa. These are millet crops. That's a local name for them. And there's quite an interesting dynamic to Satni and Satwa cultivation. So people will often dedicate large parts of their shifting cultivation plots to these millet crops. Satwa is generally used for household consumption, although it's not very tasty. People would much prefer to eat rice if they could afford it. Sometimes Satwa is sold in the market, but there's not a huge market for Satwa. Satni, on the other hand, which is a different kind of millet, is predominantly grown to produce Chin rice wine, which is a very important part of Chin culture. So millet is brewed, and it's an important part of Chin festivals and celebrations. But it also plays an important part in the economy. So land rentals are often not based on cash transactions. If you rent a piece of land from either a tribe or a landowner, you'll often pay the landowner in Kauyi, in this rice line, to access the land. So on the one hand, some quite marginal livelihood situations and unproductive agriculture. But on the other hand, Chin households making these different livelihood decisions that we might think are quite irrational in terms of putting half of their crop into producing this rice wine in the context of food insecurity, but however nonetheless play a really important cultural and social role in the lives of Chin people. So again, emphasising this livelihoods approach to understand how people make these decisions around food production and consumption.
So how about the state? What does the state government authorities think about the way that land is used in Chinpi? I know that shifting cultivation in other parts of Asia has, really had a hard time and has essentially been stamped out in many locations. What's happening in Chin State in 2017?
Yeah, well, the classic study of that, a book recently released by Tanya Lee, actually, who writes about the Indonesian uplands in Sulawesi and how, I guess, capitalism took hold there in these shifting agricultural lands, and land progressively became privately owned, and this led to increasing inequality between upland tribal people. So this is something that we're very interested in, what's going to happen in Chin in terms of land ownership. So in 2012, two important laws were passed by the Myanmar government. One's the vacant and fallow land law, the other's the farmland law. And these could have very real impacts on Chin agriculture. At the moment, not a lot of government officers will bother making journeys up to Chin into these villages to kind of see what's going on or to implement any kind of programs that might adversely affect Chin shifting agriculturalists. But there's certainly provisions within these laws that shifting agriculture and collective ownership might not be recognised as a legitimate form of ownership under the law. And so then the question becomes, what's the alternative? The alternative is often land titling, which has proved to be very problematic in a lot of different Southeast Asian countries, particularly in areas where land is collectively owned and where there's no written records over land ownership. So if you want to title land, if you want to make land identifiable and give people private ownership, you first need to establish, well, who owns what are the boundaries. Okay, these are often tied up in cultural repertoires, in verbal histories. So it's a difficult process.
All right. On this sort of topic of land and change, what about this new crop I've heard of, wahoo, that's supposed to be?
Yeah, so one of the important changes has been the influx of this new cash crop, which is known as elephant foot yam, or the Chin people call it wahoo. And there's been a few NGO projects to encourage wahoo cultivation. So elephant foot yam is actually found in the wild in Chin and in India, and it's actually quite a popular food crop in India. However, it's also very lucrative in the Chinese medicine and Japanese medicine market, as a traditional medicine. So this is what Chin people are now being encouraged to do in a lot of villages, and people are rapidly taking this up, and it's becoming a real source of wealth differentiation. Who can grow big plots of wahoo? So wahoo grows in quite poor soil, so it's well suited to the uplands of Chin. They grow it. It takes 3 years to mature as a crop. They harvest it. They slice it up, and then Chin people dry it out the front of their houses, and they then sell it to a trader who eventually trades it across the border into China. And people are starting to earn quite significant sums of money in terms of the Chin economy. So some people earning in excess of 1 million chats from producing these wahoo crops, which is quite a big sum of money for a Chin household. This increase in wahoo cultivation will perhaps have some kind of fundamental impacts on agriculture and the social relations of land in Chin State, because to grow wahoo, you need a more permanent plot. So there's a tension there between producing a crop that takes 3 years to grow and living in the context of shifting agriculture, collective ownership of land, where once you start to grow more permanent cash crops, you then again have a situation where people will want to start claiming private ownership over that land. And one interesting outcome of that is that in a couple of these villages we visited, landowners or people who own many plots of land are no longer agreeing to rent their land out to wahoo cultivators, because they fear that once their renter plants this wahoo crop, it's there for 3 years. At the end of 3 years, maybe that person won't return the land. They'll just claim the land as their own. Now my wahoo plot's in here. Okay, well, I now have rights to farm this land. So all these interesting outcomes from these rapid economic changes happening in the Chin Hills.
Wow, okay. Oh, we've run out of time. I can only imagine how detailed and interesting the reports are going to be from this research project. We've only heard about one of the three kind of large field sites today. So I very much look forward to reading those publications as they come out. When can we expect to read something like that? Yeah,
we've just released a working paper from the survey that we did last year, and we're still working through a lot of that data. It's a very large data set. But we'd expect within the next year, well, certainly this year is the writing time, so we're all focused on journal articles at the moment. Given that we want to have a policy impact, we're very keen to get this research into the hands of the right people, which involves not just publishing in journals that us academics read and perhaps not many other people do, but also producing papers that are going to be usable by policymakers and NGOs in this space. So that's certainly one impact that we hope to have with this project. In terms of the literature, one thing we're really interested in is emphasising this livelihoods approach to food security, and also emphasising livelihood diversification, that it's no longer adequate, I guess, to understand rural development as just agricultural development. So at the moment, in a lot of development thinking, there's an emphasis on market-led approaches to agricultural development in rural spaces. So this idea of connecting rural households to supply chains of supermarkets, and the idea is that this will improve rural households' capacities to grow cash crops that are wanted by people with incomes in the cities and in the West. So this is one approach to development that privileges the market But I guess what we're saying is that, particularly in places like Chin, this kind of approach to development might work for some people, particularly those that are already getting ahead and have the capacity and capability to engage in high-value agriculture. But for others, they will miss out and they will be left behind by this type of approach that doesn't account for the diversity of livelihoods and the diverse ways in which households go about shifting their way out of poverty. So all that, I guess, with the idea that for me, some sort of ideal outcome would be, I guess, a rural development world where we enable households, we give households the capabilities and the assets they need to make the appropriate livelihood decisions that fit with both their long-held traditions, such as in the case of the Chin people, and their hopes for the future.
Well, that sounds absolutely wonderful, Mark. Thanks a lot. And what I always say to guests on Myanmar Musings is, can you leave our listeners with a recommendation? Anything to do with Myanmar. It can be a book or a film or a dish or a night market.
Well, my number one recommendation would be, if you're in Yangon, head down to the Boltatong jetty around sunset and just hang out there and watch the boats come in. It's a pretty nice way to spend the evening.
That's where you're writing your journal articles, is it?
That's it.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, and I hope to see you again on Myanmar Musings. One last note, everybody. The Feeding Myanmar Research Project has a website at feedingmyanmar.wordpress.com.